The sky burned orange against the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, June 17, 1943. Dawn was breaking over the Solomon Islands chain, where American and Japanese naval forces had been locked in a desperate struggle for control of the strategic waterways. Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich stood alone on the flight deck of the USS Saratoga, his weathered face fixed upon the horizon. The acrid smell of fuel and salt air filled his lungs as his flight crew prepared his TBF Avenger torpedo bomber for what would become the most extraordinary mission of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn briefing had been grim. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Aoba and Furutaka, had been spotted moving through the strait west of New Georgia Island. Intelligence suggested they were heading to bombard American positions on Rendova, where thousands of Marines had established a tenuous beachhead just days earlier. Those Marines would be completely exposed to the cruiser's 8-inch guns. The only hope for those men lay with Aldrich and his squadron of torpedo bombers. "Sir, weather report just came in," his radio man. Petty Officer Raymond Duval approached with a folded paper. "Heavy cloud cover over the target area. Visibility below 100 yards in some places." Aldrich nodded grimly, tucking the report into his flight suit without comment. The other pilots were already climbing into their aircraft, men following orders despite knowing the nearly impossible odds they faced. None of them spoke what they all understood, that to fly a slow, lumbering torpedo bomber through heavy cloud cover against Japanese warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns was essentially a suicide mission. What no one in the squadron realized that morning was that Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich had already decided he would attempt something never before tried in naval combat, a torpedo attack executed entirely on instruments and dead reckoning, without visual confirmation of the target. A blind torpedo run. No one on the carrier deck could have known that this single decision would not only save thousands of Marine lives, but would fundamentally change naval aviation doctrine for decades to come. Mason Aldrich was born October 3, 1913, in the small coastal town of Bristol, Maine. The son of a lobster fisherman and a schoolteacher, he grew up with the sea in his blood and adventure in his heart. His father, Esteban Aldrich, had immigrated to America from Spain as a young man, bringing with him generations of seafaring knowledge. His mother, Elizabeth, descended from a long line of New England mariners who had sailed the world's oceans since the 18th century. Young Mason spent his childhood on the water, learning to navigate by stars and reading the currents and tides the way other children learned their alphabet. By age 12, he could pilot his father's fishing boat through the treacherous rock-strewn waters of the Maine coast in thick fog, relying solely on sound, feel, and his uncanny sense of direction. "The sea doesn't care if you can see it or not," his father had taught him. "She follows the same rules regardless. Learn those rules, respect them, and you can navigate through anything." Those early lessons would prove prophetic decades later in the Solomon Islands. At 17, rather than following his father into the fishing trade, Mason stunned his family by announcing his intention to attend the U.S. Naval Academy. His high school mathematics teacher, recognizing the boy's exceptional aptitude for navigation and spatial reasoning, had encouraged him to apply and helped secure a recommendation from their congressman. "My father didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after I told him," Aldrich would later recall in a 1978 interview for the Naval History Museum. "He couldn't understand why I'd want to serve on those floating steel prisons, as he called them, when I could be my own master on a fishing boat." Nevertheless, in 1930, Mason Aldrich left Maine for Annapolis, where he quickly distinguished himself as a natural navigator and leader. His classmates nicknamed him the Compass for his unerring sense of direction during orienteering exercises and naval maneuvers. One instructor noted that Aldrich could determine his position within yards, even in complete darkness or heavy fog, a skill that would later save his life and the lives of countless others. Graduating in 1934, near the top of his class, Ensign Aldrich initially served on the battleship USS Pennsylvania before volunteering for flight training in 1937. Naval aviation was still developing as a warfare doctrine, and ambitious officers saw it as a path to advancement. For Aldrich, however, the attraction was more fundamental. "I still loved the sea," he wrote in his unpublished memoirs, "but I had discovered that the view from above gave me an entirely new perspective on navigation. From the air, I could see patterns in ocean currents and cloud formations that were invisible from deck level. By 1941, Lieutenant Aldrich had become one of the Navy's most skilled pilots, with a particular talent for instrument flying. When most pilots still relied primarily on visual navigation, Aldrich insisted on practicing blind flying techniques, navigating solely by instruments through clouds and darkness. His squadron mates thought him peculiar, even obsessive about these drills. Mason would run simulations where he'd cover his cockpit windows with canvas and fly complex patterns using only his instruments, recalled Commander Harrison Wilkes, who served with Aldrich in Torpedo Squadron 6. We thought he was crazy. Nobody flew torpedoes without visual reference in those days. It simply wasn't done. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Lieutenant Aldrich was serving as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Like thousands of other naval officers, he immediately requested transfer to a combat assignment. By February 1942, he had joined Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the carrier USS Hornet, just in time for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. The following months brought bitter lessons about the challenges of torpedo bombing. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 suffered devastating losses. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived from the entire squadron. The obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were simply too slow, making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. By early 1943, Aldrich had been promoted to lieutenant commander and transferred to Torpedo Squadron 11 aboard USS Saratoga, now equipped with the newer TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Though still vulnerable during their attack runs, the Avengers were more rugged and capable than their predecessors. Equally important, they carried more sophisticated navigation and targeting instruments, which Aldrich studied obsessively. He would spend hours talking with the maintenance crews about the exact specifications and limitations of each instrument, recalled aviation machinist, mate first class Howard Kellerman. Most pilots just wanted to know if their aircraft was ready to fly. Aldrich wanted to understand exactly how everything worked, especially the compass system and attitude indicators. This meticulous attention to detail would soon prove invaluable as Torpedo Squadron 11 faced increasingly desperate combat situations in the Solomon Islands campaign. By June 1943, the Americans were advancing up the Solomon chain, establishing footholds on islands that would serve as stepping stones toward the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. The landings on Rendova Island on June 30th were particularly vital. From Rendova, American forces could support the upcoming invasion of New Georgia and eventually neutralize the major Japanese base at Munda. Protecting those exposed marine beachheads became the primary mission of carrier aircraft in the region. When intelligence reports indicated that 2 Japanese heavy cruisers were moving to bombard the Rendova beachhead, Admiral William Halsey understood immediately what was at stake. If those cruisers reached their destination, thousands of Marines would be caught in the open, with minimal artillery support and nowhere to retreat. The evening before the fateful mission, Aldrich was called to the flag bridge to meet with Admiral Halsey and the Saratoga's captain, Lawrence Safford. The atmosphere was grim as they reviewed the latest intelligence. The cruisers will reach firing position by 0700 hours, Safford explained, pointing to positions on the chart. If they aren't stopped, they'll devastate our landing forces before they can establish defensive positions. Halsey fixed Aldrich with his famous intense gaze. I need those cruisers at the bottom of the ocean, Commander. I don't care how you do it. Aldrich studied the chart, noting the narrow passage the Japanese ships would need to navigate. Sir, weather forecast indicates heavy cloud cover and rain in the target area. Visibility will be nearly zero. Then you'll have to find another way, Halsey replied. Those Marines are counting on us. As Aldrich turned to leave, Captain Safford called after him. Mason, the conventional approach won't work here. Just remember what you've been practicing all these years. This might be the time for it. Back in his quarters, Aldrich pulled out his navigation charts and began calculating. If the Japanese cruisers maintained their current speed and course, they would pass through a narrow channel between 2 small islands. The passage was barely wide enough for the warships to navigate safely, meaning they would have to maintain a predictable course and reduced speed. For hours he worked through calculations, plotting precise headings, altitudes, and timings. If he couldn't see the targets, he would have to use the islands as reference points, then execute a perfectly timed torpedo run, based purely on his instruments and dead reckoning. It was theoretically possible, but had never been attempted in combat. At 3:30 in the morning, Aldrich briefed his squadron on the mission. He explained his unconventional plan, outlining each pilot's role with characteristic precision. The 8 Avengers would fly in 2 divisions. Aldrich would lead the first 4 aircraft in the primary attack, while Lieutenant Wallace Hammond would command the 2nd Division as backup. "I won't order anyone to fly this mission," Aldrich concluded. "The odds are long, and I can't guarantee we'll all make it back. If anyone wants to stand down, speak now, and there will be no mark against your record." The room remained silent. These men had flown together for months, building the kind of bond that only forms in combat. If their commander believed the mission possible, they would follow him. As dawn broke over the Solomon Sea on June 17, 1943, the 8 TBF Avengers of Torpedo Squadron 11 thundered down the Saratoga's flight deck and lifted into the grey morning sky. Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich led the formation southwest toward Rendova, climbing to 3,000 feet to stay above the low-hanging clouds. In the second seat of Aldrich's Avenger, 22-year-old Ensign James Moretti served as bombardier, navigator. Behind him, Petty Officer Raymond Duval manned the radio and dorsal gun turret. Both men had flown dozens of combat missions with Aldrich and trusted him implicitly, even as they headed toward what many would consider an impossible task. The cloud cover was just as bad as predicted, Moretti would later recall. As we approached the target area, visibility dropped to nearly 0. I couldn't see the wingtips of our own aircraft, let alone the ocean below or the other planes in our formation. Under normal circumstances, the mission would have been aborted or at least delayed until weather conditions improved. But the Marines on Rendova didn't have that luxury. The Japanese cruisers would reach their bombardment positions within hours. At precisely 6:15 in the morning, Aldrich's voice crackled over the radio. "Execute Plan Baker. Drop to 1,000 feet and maintain heading 270. Radio silence from this point forward." Plan Baker was Aldrich's code for the blind torpedo attack procedure he had developed. Rather than the standard approach of visually acquiring the target, before beginning the torpedo run, each pilot would descend through the cloud cover on instruments alone, using precise timing and navigation to position themselves for attack. The Avengers descended in tight formation, their pilots flying solely by reference to their instrument panels. Through his rain-streaked windscreen, Aldrich could see nothing but grey mist. Yet his hands remained steady on the controls, his eyes moving methodically between his attitude indicator, compass, and chronometer. At precisely 6:22, the formation reached 1,000 feet and leveled off. According to Aldrich's calculations, they were now directly above the narrow passage where the Japanese cruisers would be traveling. But in the thick cloud cover, there was no way to visually confirm their position. This was the moment of decision. Standard doctrine dictated that torpedo attacks required visual acquisition of the target. To launch without seeing the enemy was considered reckless, even suicidal. Yet Aldrich had absolute confidence in his calculations and his pilot's ability to execute his plan. "Commence attack sequence," he ordered over the radio. "Drop to 50 feet on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The 8 Avengers nosed over and descended through the clouds. Their pilots focused intently on maintaining proper attitude and descent rate without visual reference. For the gunners and navigators in the rear compartments, the sensation was terrifying, plunging blindly toward the ocean with no way to see what lay ahead. At 200 feet, Aldrich's Avenger broke through the bottom of the cloud layer. In that instant, his meticulous planning met the chaotic reality of combat. Through gaps in the mist, he caught fleeting glimpses of the sea below and, incredibly, the distinctive silhouettes of 2 Japanese heavy cruisers moving in line-ahead formation less than a mile away. His calculations had been perfect. The Japanese ships were exactly where he had predicted, following the narrow channel at reduced speed, just as he had anticipated. "Targets confirmed," he transmitted. "Execute torpedo attack. Stay on instruments until final approach." The 8 Avengers continued their descent, breaking through the cloud cover one by one. Each pilot had memorized the precise heading, altitude, and timing required for their torpedo run. Even as Japanese anti-aircraft guns began to track them, the American pilots maintained rigid discipline, following their instruments rather than reacting to the chaos around them. Aldrich led his division directly toward the lead cruiser, the Ioba. At 50 feet above the waves, flying at the painfully slow speed required for torpedo delivery, the Avengers became easy targets. Tracers arced toward them from multiple gun positions on both Japanese warships. "Steady, steady," Aldrich murmured, more to himself than to his crew. The Ioba loomed larger in his windscreen as the range closed. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, shell bursts rocking his aircraft. A round punched through the fuselage just behind the cockpit, narrowly missing Duval at his radio station. At precisely the calculated moment, Aldrich pressed the torpedo release. "Torpedo away!" he called, immediately banking his Avenger hard to starboard to clear the target area. Behind him, the 1,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo struck the water cleanly, its motor engaging as it began its run toward the Japanese cruiser. Following their commander's lead, the other pilots in the 1st Division released their torpedoes in sequence, then broke away in different directions to confuse the Japanese gunners. Lieutenant Hammond's 2nd Division, emerging from the clouds moments later, executed their attack runs against the trailing cruiser, Furutaka. As Aldrich pulled his Avenger into a climbing turn, anti-aircraft fire found its mark. A shell exploded near his right wing, shredding the control surfaces and sending the aircraft into a violent roll. Fighting the controls, he managed to level out, but the Avenger was badly damaged. "Engine losing power," he reported calmly. "We're heading for the rendezvous point. 2nd Division, complete your attack and withdraw." Through gaps in the clouds, the American pilots caught glimpses of their torpedoes striking home. 2 hit the Oba amidships, sending massive columns of water into the air. At least 1 torpedo struck the Furutaka near her forward turrets. As the damaged Avengers limped away from the target area, climbing back into the cloud cover, they had no way of knowing the full extent of their success. Radio silence was maintained as they navigated back toward the Saratoga. Each pilot focused on keeping his damaged aircraft airborne. Of the 8 Avengers that participated in the attack, only 5 would return to the carrier. 3 had been shot down during the torpedo runs, their crews lost. Aldrich's aircraft, severely damaged by anti-aircraft fire, barely made it back to the Saratoga, where it had to be pushed over the side after landing because of its extensive damage. As the pilots debriefed, the full impact of their mission remained unclear. Had the torpedoes actually hit their targets? Had they stopped the Japanese bombardment of Rendova? With no aerial reconnaissance possible due to the continuing bad weather, they could only report what they had glimpsed through breaks in the clouds, torpedo hits on both cruisers, but no confirmation of sinkings. It wasn't until 3 days later that a patrol plane spotted oil slicks and debris at the location where Aldrich's squadron had made their attack. Subsequent intelligence reports, including intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, confirmed that both cruisers had indeed been sunk. The Oba had gone down within 30 minutes of being hit, while the Furutaka, though more severely damaged, had taken longer to sink as her crew attempted to save the vessel. The Marines on Rendova never faced the bombardment that would have likely decimated their positions. Instead, they were able to establish their beachhead and support the subsequent operations against Japanese forces on New Georgia. In the after-action report filed by Admiral Halsey, Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich's blind torpedo attack was described as one of the most extraordinary feats of naval aviation in this war. The report specifically highlighted the unprecedented nature of executing a coordinated torpedo attack without visual acquisition of the targets until the final moments. Aldrich himself was more measured in his assessment. "We were lucky," he told a war correspondent 3 weeks after the mission. "The Japanese were where we calculated they would be, and our torpedoes ran true. 9 times out of 10, a blind attack like that would fail completely. But when thousands of Marines are counting on you, even long odds are worth taking. For his extraordinary leadership and courage, Aldrich was awarded the Navy Cross, our nation's second highest decoration for valor. The citation specifically mentioned his exceptional airmanship and determined fighting spirit in pressing home an attack under conditions that would have justified cancellation of the mission. The 5 surviving pilots of his squadron also received decorations, including Silver Stars for Lieutenant Wallace Hammond and Lieutenant Junior Grade Peter Forrestal, whose torpedoes were credited with striking the Furutaka. Perhaps more significant than the medals, however, was the impact of Aldrich's mission on naval aviation doctrine. In the weeks following what became known as the Blind Run, Navy training commands began incorporating instrument-only torpedo attack procedures into their curriculum. Pilots were now expected to practice and master the techniques that Aldrich had pioneered, using precise navigation and timing to execute attacks when visual conditions were poor. By 1944, these techniques had become standard procedure throughout naval aviation, resulting in successful torpedo attacks during numerous engagements where weather or darkness would previously have forced mission cancellation. The ability to launch effective attacks in any conditions gave American forces a significant advantage in the later stages of the Pacific War. After the Rendova operation, Lieutenant Commander Aldrich continued to serve with distinction throughout the Solomon Islands campaign and subsequent operations in the Philippines. By war's end, he had been promoted to commander and given command of his own air group. The cost of war, however, exacted a personal toll. During a Japanese air attack on the USS Lexington in June 1944, Aldrich's younger brother, Lieutenant Robert Aldrich, was killed while manning an anti-aircraft position on the carrier's island. Mason was flying combat air patrol above the fleet during the attack and witnessed the hit that claimed his brother's life. Despite this devastating loss, Aldrich remained on active duty through the final campaigns of the war. Those who served with him noted that he became even more focused and methodical after his brother's death, channeling his grief into an unwavering commitment to protecting the ships and men under his command. When the war ended in August 1945, Commander Mason Aldrich had accumulated over 100 combat missions, been awarded the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and numerous other decorations, and was credited with developing tactics that saved countless American lives. Rather than returning to civilian life after the war, Aldrich chose to remain in the Navy, where he continued to influence naval aviation. In 1948, he was assigned to the Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland, where he helped develop all-weather attack procedures for the new generation of jet aircraft entering service. Promoted to captain in 1952, Aldrich commanded the carrier USS Princeton during the Korean War, where his expertise in all-weather operations proved invaluable in maintaining consistent air support for ground forces, even during the notoriously bad weather of the Korean Peninsula. His final posting before retirement was as commander of Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia, where he established advanced training programs specifically focused on night and adverse weather operations, a lasting legacy of his experiences in the Solomon Islands. Captain Mason Aldrich retired from active duty in 1963 after 30 years of distinguished service. Settling in his hometown of Bristol, Maine, he finally embraced his family's maritime heritage, purchasing a small fishing boat that he operated well into his 70s. "The sea and I came to an understanding," as he told a local newspaper on his 80th birthday. "She tried to kill me a few times during the war, but in the end we made our peace." On November 12, 1986, Mason Aldrich passed away peacefully at his home overlooking the harbor in Bristol. He was 73 years old. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were scattered at sea by Navy aircraft flying from the carrier USS Saratoga, the same vessel from which he had launched his historic mission 43 years earlier. The official history of naval aviation records Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich's blind torpedo attack as a singular achievement, the only successful torpedo attack executed without visual acquisition of the target until the final approach. Yet its significance extends far beyond that single mission. What Aldrich demonstrated that foggy morning in the Solomon Islands was that the limitations of weather, visibility, and conventional doctrine could be overcome through precise planning, rigorous training, and bold execution. By trusting his instruments and calculations over what his eyes could or could not see, he fundamentally changed how naval aviation approached adverse conditions. In today's Navy, all-weather attack capabilities are taken for granted. Modern aircraft equipped with sophisticated radar and navigation systems routinely strike targets in darkness, storms, and other challenging conditions. Yet every pilot who executes such missions stands on the shoulders of innovators like Mason Aldrich, who first proved such attacks possible. Perhaps the most revealing testament to Aldrich's legacy came not from official histories or medal citations, but from a letter written by a Marine who had been on the beaches of Rendova that June morning in 1943. Decades after the war, this veteran wrote to Aldrich, "You never saw us and we never saw you through those clouds. But when the Japanese cruisers failed to appear, we knew someone up there had done the impossible to protect us. Thousands of Marines came home because of what you and your pilots did that day. We never forgot it." In naval aviation circles, the term Aldrich weather came to describe conditions too poor for conventional operations, but not quite impossible, the grey area where precise navigation and instrument flying could overcome natural obstacles. It was in this challenging middle ground that Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich made his mark, turning what should have been a mission-cancelling liability into an unexpected advantage. His story reminds us that in warfare, as in life, the difference between impossible and merely difficult often comes down to preparation, innovation, and the courage to attempt what others dismiss as unachievable. When faced with the choice between accepting limitations or finding ways to overcome them, Aldrich consistently chose the latter path. Today, when Navy pilots train for adverse weather operations, instructors still reference the blind run as the origin point of modern all-weather attack doctrine. The detailed calculations, precise timing, and instrument discipline that Aldrich pioneered have evolved into sophisticated electronic systems, but the fundamental approach remains unchanged. Would you have the courage to fly through clouds toward an unseen enemy, trusting your instruments and calculations when your eyes could tell you nothing? Would you risk everything on a mission that conventional wisdom deemed impossible? These are the questions that Mason Aldrich's story poses to each new generation of military aviators. His legacy challenges us to look beyond what seems possible at first glance and ask instead what might be achievable with sufficient preparation, innovation, and determination. In doing so, he exemplifies the spirit that has defined American military aviation since its earliest days, the relentless pursuit of new capabilities that expand the boundaries of the possible. Remember Lieutenant Commander Mason Aldrich and his blind torpedo run the next time someone tells you something can't be done. Share this incredible story of courage and innovation with others, so that the lessons of this remarkable mission continue to inspire future generations to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The courage to fly blind when necessary, toward goals that others cannot yet see, remains as valuable in peace as it was in war.